The evening had stretched longer than I had expected. My husband's office had organized a small dinner gathering at a restaurant to celebrate the completion of a project. It wasn't a grand event, more of a casual get-together among colleagues, with a few spouses invited along. I hadn't planned on staying late, but the conversations and laughter kept flowing, and soon I found myself glancing at my watch, realizing it was already past 10:30 p.m. My husband, as always, was the center of attention when it came to work discussions. While the rest of us were finishing dessert and exchanging light-hearted jokes, he was pulled aside by his boss for what looked like a serious conversation. I didn't think much of it. He often got caught up in last-minute office talk. But as the minutes stretched on, I began to feel restless. I was tired, and honestly, all I wanted at that point was to get home, change into my pajamas, and collapse on the couch. I had just started scrolling through my phone to pass the time when one of his colleagues, Daniel, approached me. Daniel wasn't someone I knew particularly well. He was polite at the office gatherings I'd attended, but we had never spoken at length. He was a bit younger than my husband, sharp-dressed, with a quiet confidence that made him stand out. He gave me an easy smile and said, "Looks like you're ready to head out. Do you need a ride? I'm going the same direction." At first, I hesitated. My instinct was to decline and wait for my husband, but I glanced back at him, still deep in discussion with his boss, his hands moving animatedly as he explained something. I could tell it wouldn't be over anytime soon. Daniel must have caught my hesitation because he added quickly, "Really, it's no trouble at all. It's late, and I wouldn't want you waiting around here by yourself." I weighed my options. It did seem a little awkward to accept a ride from one of my husband's colleagues, but at the same time, it felt even more inconvenient to sit there another half hour while the men wrapped up their work talk. Besides, Daniel had always seemed polite and professional. Surely there couldn't be any harm in a short, friendly ride home. So I smiled politely and said, "If you're sure it's not out of your way, then thank you." "Not at all," he replied warmly, gesturing toward the door. As we stepped outside, the cool night air brushed against my skin, making me wrap my shawl tighter around me. Daniel led the way to his car, a sleek black sedan that seemed to gleam under the streetlights. He opened the passenger door for me, a small gesture that made me think of him as courteous, perhaps even old-fashioned. Sliding into the seat, I told myself there was nothing unusual about the situation. It was just a friendly offer from a coworker of my husband's, just a simple ride home. At least, that's what I thought. The car ride began as smoothly as I expected. Daniel started the engine, and the low hum of the vehicle filled the otherwise quiet night. The streets outside the restaurant were calm, washed in the soft glow of street lamps. For a moment, I felt relieved. The decision to accept his offer seemed harmless, even convenient. Daniel broke the silence first. "So did you enjoy tonight? These office dinners can be hit or miss." I chuckled lightly. "It was nice. I don't usually come to these things, but I had a good time. Everyone seems to get along well outside of the office." "That's true," he said, his eyes focused on the road. "But you know, I think people behave differently when their spouses are around. More civilized, I guess." He shot me a quick grin, and I laughed, brushing the comment off. The conversation drifted to lighter topics. He asked about my favorite restaurants in town, the kind of movies I liked, even whether I cooked. I answered politely, finding the exchange easy and natural. There was nothing alarming in his tone. It was casual, almost charming. He carried himself with an ease that made the ride feel less awkward than I had feared. At one point, he complimented the way I had handled myself at dinner. "You know," he said, glancing briefly at me, "you have a really warm presence. You make people feel comfortable around you. Not everyone has that." I smiled, a little taken aback. "Thank you. That's kind of you to say." He nodded, his lips curving in a faint smile. "It's true. Even at the table tonight, you had everyone laughing. You remind me a little of my sister. She has that same energy." The comparison put me at ease. Compliments could sometimes feel loaded, but his seemed innocent enough. After all, people often made such remarks in casual conversation. I told myself not to overthink it. The city lights slipped by outside the window, and I relaxed into the seat. It felt almost like talking to an old acquaintance rather than one of my husband's co-workers. I found myself responding with more openness than I'd expected, sharing a funny story about my cooking mishaps, which made him laugh. But then the tone of his comments shifted, just slightly. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "you really don't look like someone's wife tonight. More like, I don't know, someone younger, carefree." I blinked, unsure of how to respond. His words lingered, carrying a weight that his earlier compliments hadn't. I forced a small laugh, hoping to keep things light. "I'll take that as a compliment, I think." He chuckled too, but his glance lingered on me a beat longer than before. It wasn't threatening, not yet, but it made me aware of the closeness inside the car, of how late it was, of the fact that I was alone with him. Still, I reminded myself it was just a ride. Just a friendly ride home? There was no reason to feel uneasy. At least that's what I kept telling myself as the road stretched ahead of us. The rhythm of the drive changed gradually, almost so subtly that I didn't notice it at first. What had begun as light-hearted small talk started veering into more personal territory. The friendly atmosphere, the easy laughter began to fade, replaced by something quieter, heavier. Daniel's voice carried a different note now, less casual. "So, how long have you and Mark been married?" he asked, keeping his gaze on the road. 8 years, I replied, smiling faintly. "Feels like it's flown by." 8 years is a long time, he murmured, almost as if he were speaking to himself. After a pause, he added, "Do you ever, I don't know, feel like he still notices you the way he did at the beginning?" The question caught me off guard. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, not sure how to answer. "Of course," I said, perhaps too quickly. "Marriage changes, but it doesn't mean it gets worse. It just evolves." He nodded slowly, though the expression on his face was unreadable. "You're lucky then," he said after a moment. "Most people I know, by this point, they're just existing together. Like roommates." His words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. I laughed lightly, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "Well, I guess it depends on the couple." But Daniel wasn't letting it go. "Sometimes I wonder how many people actually feel seen in their marriages," he continued. His tone wasn't hostile, but it was probing, deliberate. "I notice things, you know, little things. Like tonight, I could tell you were smiling, but your eyes looked a little tired. Almost like you were trying to keep up appearances." I blinked, startled by the observation. "You notice a lot for someone who barely knows me," I said, keeping my voice calm. He chuckled, though there was a seriousness underneath it. "I pay attention, more than most people, and honestly, it's hard not to notice someone like you." That was the first moment a flicker of unease rippled through me. The compliment didn't feel harmless this time. It felt pointed. I stared out the window, watching the blur of passing lights, wishing the drive would speed up. Daniel seemed to sense my hesitation, but instead of pulling back, he leaned further. "You deserve to be appreciated. I mean, really appreciated. Not just for being someone's wife or someone's +1 at work dinners, but for who you are." The way he said it, soft, persuasive, made my stomach tighten. This wasn't just polite conversation anymore. He was crossing a line gently but unmistakably. I cleared my throat, forcing a polite smile. "Well, I think my husband does a pretty good job of that. Does he?" Daniel asked quietly, almost challengingly. His eyes flicked toward me briefly before returning to the road. It was in that instant that I realized the ride wasn't as simple as I had convinced myself it would be. The friendliness was slipping, giving way to something else, something more dangerous. I shifted in my seat, my mind racing, and for the first time I wished I had simply waited for my husband back at the restaurant. The city blocks I knew so well began to feel unfamiliar as we drove deeper into the night. At first I didn't notice. My mind was too busy replaying Daniel's last words, trying to brush them aside as harmless observations. But when I looked up again, I realized the streets didn't look quite right. The storefronts and houses I usually passed on my way home were absent, replaced instead by quiet stretches of road, the occasional flickering streetlight casting uneasy shadows. I began carefully, trying to keep my tone neutral. "This isn't the usual way to my neighborhood." Daniel glanced at me, a calm smile tugging at his lips. "It's a shortcut." "Don't worry, I know what I'm doing." Something about the way he said it didn't reassure me. My heart thumped a little harder in my chest. and I instinctively adjusted my shawl tighter around my shoulders, a small barrier against the sudden tension filling the car. The silence stretched longer this time, and when Daniel finally spoke, it wasn't with the same casual tone he'd used earlier. You know, you really are different from most of the women I meet. They're either too guarded or too eager. But you're genuine, real. I forced a laugh, light but hollow. That's kind of you to say. He kept his eyes on the road, but I could feel his glances at me, lingering too long, too intently. I mean it. I watched you tonight. How you smiled, how you carried yourself. Mark doesn't even realize how lucky he is, does he? My pulse quickened. I think he does, I replied firmly. Daniel didn't respond right away. Instead, he let out a slow breath, as if weighing his next words. Maybe. But I couldn't help but notice how often he left you sitting there alone while he was busy with work talk. A woman like you deserves more than being someone's afterthought. The words sank in like stones. My hands fidgeted in my lap as I searched for something, anything, that would put an end to this strange, unsettling direction the conversation had taken. But before I could speak, Daniel slowed the car at a red light. The dim glow from the traffic signal cast a reddish tint over his face, accentuating the intensity in his eyes when he finally turned toward me. "Tell me honestly," he said, his voice lower now, almost coaxing. "Do you ever feel invisible?" I felt the question like a trap. My throat tightened as I shook my head. "No, I'm not invisible. And I think we should keep this conversation professional. You're my husband's colleague, Daniel." For the first time that night, his smile faltered. He gave a short laugh, but it lacked the warmth from before. "Professional, right." His knuckles tightened slightly on the steering wheel, and though his expression remained composed, there was something darker beneath it. The light turned green, and the car rolled forward again. But I couldn't shake the realization that I wasn't just riding home anymore. I was trapped in a situation I hadn't anticipated, with someone whose intentions were no longer friendly at all. The shortcut wasn't just about roads. It was about him taking liberties, crossing boundaries I hadn't given permission for. And now, every passing second in that car felt like a risk. The tension in the car grew heavier with every passing block. My heartbeat was no longer steady. It pulsed against my ribs, sharp and fast. The once quiet, harmless hum of the engine now seemed oppressive, filling the silence that neither of us was breaking. I knew I couldn't let this go on any longer. I straightened in my seat, trying to inject a firmness into my voice. "Daniel, I'd like you to take me home. The direct way. No more shortcuts." For a moment, he didn't respond, his jaw tightening as his hands gripped the steering wheel. Then he gave a short laugh, though it rang hollow. "Relax, I told you, it's fine. We'll be there soon." "Don't you trust me?" "I trusted you when I got into the car," I said evenly, keeping my gaze fixed on the road ahead. "But right now, you're making me uncomfortable." His eyes flicked toward me, a flash of irritation breaking through his mask of calm. "Uncomfortable? I'm just talking to you. Being honest. Most women would appreciate that." I folded my arms across my chest, not as a sign of defiance, but as a shield. "Well, I don't. Take me home, Daniel." The car slowed slightly, and for a terrifying second, I thought he might pull over somewhere deserted. But then he pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine roaring as the car surged forward. He let out a humorless chuckle. "You don't have to be so defensive. I'm not trying to hurt you. I see you, that's all. More than Mark ever does." His words made my stomach knot. The casual kindness from earlier had twisted into something possessive, unsettling. I glanced around, noting landmarks, silently calculating how far I might be from home, from safety. My hand drifted to my bag, my phone inside it, though I wasn't sure what good it would do in that moment. Gathering every ounce of courage, I turned to face him fully. "Listen to me carefully," I said, my voice sharper now, carrying a strength I hadn't felt before. "You need to stop whatever this is. You're my husband's colleague, and this conversation, this behavior, it's inappropriate. If you don't take me home right now, I will call him, and I will tell him everything." The silence that followed was suffocating. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as though weighing his next move. Finally, he exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You're tougher than I thought," he muttered, a trace of bitterness in his tone. For the rest of the drive, the air inside the car was thick with tension. He didn't speak again, though I could feel the shift in his demeanor. No longer playful, no longer charming. There was a hardness now, a simmering edge that made every second feel like walking on glass. But I didn't back down. I sat upright, my hands clenched together in my lap, my eyes fixed on the familiar streets that finally began to appear. Relief flickered inside me, but it was laced with the sharp edge of fear. I had drawn my line, and though he had backed off, I knew the ride home wasn't over yet. The car pulled up to my street at last, and I felt a rush of relief wash through me the moment I saw the familiar row of houses. My heart was still racing, my palms damp, but the sight of home was like a lighthouse cutting through storm clouds. Daniel slowed to a stop just a few feet from my driveway. For a moment, he didn't unlock the doors. The pause made my chest tighten. Then, with a small click, the locks released. He leaned slightly toward me, his voice lower, heavier than it had been before. "You don't have to be afraid of me." I meant every word. "You deserve to hear it, even if your husband never says it." I gripped the handle of the door, forcing myself to meet his gaze just once. His expression wasn't smug now. It was something else, a mix of frustration and longing, twisted into something unsettling. I didn't reply. Words felt useless at that point. Instead, I opened the door quickly and stepped out, the cool night air rushing over me like a shield. "Good night, Daniel," I said firmly, my voice steadier than I felt. Without giving him a chance to answer, I closed the door behind me. I walked up the path to my house, each step feeling impossibly long. I didn't dare look back until I was at the door, fumbling with my keys. Only then did I glance over my shoulder. The car was still there, engine idling, his silhouette faintly visible behind the wheel. He didn't move for a few seconds, and then finally the car rolled forward and disappeared into the night. Inside, the house was dark and quiet. I sank onto the couch, my whole body trembling now that the tension had broken. My mind was a whirlwind, relief, fear, anger, disbelief. What had started as a simple ride home had turned into something I couldn't have predicted, something that left me shaken to my core. My first instinct was to call my husband. But as I stared at my phone, doubts crept in. What would telling him do? He worked with Daniel. An accusation could explode into something complicated, messy. Would he believe me? Would he confront Daniel? Would it spiral into tension at work, rumors, questions? Yet the alternative, keeping it to myself, felt like swallowing poison. I wrapped my arms around my knees, torn between the urge to speak and the desire to bury the night deep where no one could find it. The truth was, I hadn't been hurt physically, but the violation was still real. Daniel had crossed a line I never expected him to, shattering the assumption of safety I had placed in him simply because he was my husband's colleague. I realized then how fragile that trust had been. As I finally climbed into bed later that night, long after my husband came home and drifted into sleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling. The quiet should have been comforting, but instead, it felt loaded. One decision, accepting a ride I thought was harmless, had shifted the way I looked at people, at boundaries, at trust. I knew nothing would feel quite the same again. And though I didn't say a word to my husband that night, I knew I would never forget the ride, or the man who turned it into something I'd spend years remembering.